Hello and welcome to the third episode of History Through Our Screens. Today we're going to be covering kind of a more of a philosophical topic, but it still does have lead-ins back to the media that we usually cover. Today we're going to be going over kind of our thoughts on government conscription in the military. And as a jumping point to that, we're going to be looking at the movie 300 and its ideas of freedom under a government that kind of mandates military service. As I've hosted this podcast before, my name is Gorren. I'm going to let the other co-hosts introduce themselves as well.
I've been on the podcast before. My name is Trevor.
Hi, I'm Ryan. I'm a Scottish university student.
I am Collin, and I am a history student at Trevor University.
All right. So to kick it off, as I said, our kind of underlying media theme for this will be the movie 300, and I assume everyone here has seen that.
Yep.
It's a good movie for the most part.
Yeah. Maybe not horribly historical, but it's
Certainly
out there.
Action-packed, yeah.
Yeah, it's not the most historical movie, but if we're talking about sourced adaptation based off a graphic novel, that was pretty decent.
Yeah, and I think it might have helped some people jump into Greek history that might not have been interested in before.
It was definitely my first introduction to Greek history. It kind of made me want to make out like what is Hollywood fiction and what's real.
Right, and I think as our previous episodes, we always appreciate something that helps people get into a deeper study.
Definitely.
I think what we're going to be focusing on the aspect of 300 today, not that we won't revisit that movie for other purposes later, but kind of the idea that the Spartans portray themselves throughout the film as the freemen, those who have liberty against the Persian Empire, and they see them as kind of a slave empire, and they're worried about their culture and their way of life being taken over by the Persians, and they themselves being, inducted into Persian slavery. And I think we all, at least all the co-hosts here I know, we've had a discussion about how the Persian Empire, strangely enough, had outlawed slavery at that time. The Spartans themselves had an entire economy based on slave labor. And the Spartans themselves, even though they run the society, at a very young age, they're inducted into the Spartan government military service. And that's not optional. Every Spartan male is required to put up military service for their entire life. And as a result of that, it seems kind of odd that they portray themselves as free, when in reality, it seems like they're bound to government service. I don't know if y'all had anything to add on to that.
Oh yeah, it's definitely like that. It is interesting how they always say that, we're fighting for, freedom and all this stuff. But at the same time, yeah, they are being forced to do it.
I think it's quite interesting. I saw some comparisons made between the Third Reich's propaganda when they portrayed their war with the Soviet Union, and how they try to link it back to ancient Greece. And in their wars, they once again try to portray themselves as a sort of individual, clever-minded one man against a mindless horde, sort of West versus East kind of situation. And I think that to some extent, I think Hollywood has bought into the same sort of narrative of here are these mindless hordes from the East, and obviously ancient Greece is remembered as the sort of cradle of democracy, the first place, at least, the Athenian city-state was, even though, 90% or something of the population couldn't vote, but it's still seen as the first democracy.
Right, maybe relatively they had more democracy than people around them.
Mm-hmm. So I think Hollywood, to some extent, has bought into this idea of there's the mindless, chaotic, evil East, and then there's the enlightened, the sort of the free West, which I think just doesn't hold up to any kind of scrutiny, really.
No, and I agree with you. I think some of that is Hollywood propaganda. They want to build up a hero on one side, and despite maybe the historical realities, it's just not, at least for the Persians in this case, that's just not true. This practice of slavery for them, I believe from the studies I've done, that just wasn't the case.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's purposeful. I think they've maybe fallen into the trap of doing that, perhaps. I mean, perhaps even just to perhaps someone subconsciously thought like, oh, this is going to go down well with a sort of a European American audience anyway.
Right.
Well, I
And
think.
go ahead.
Well, I think it's interesting too is that like I don't think they really want to cover topics like this because at the end of the day, it's being sold as an action movie, and I think they were just trying to make it as hey, look, here are the Spartans fighting for what they believe is a just cause, and arguably for the audience, it is a just cause, but that's just from the movie's perspective. And I think it's more about that. They aren't trying to cover and trying to be historically accurate. They're more like, hey, we're going to use this as a setting to tell a story, and instead of it being, truly historically accurate.
I agree. I think to accomplish the end goals of their movie, they probably took, they kind of shaped the narrative they wanted, the way they wanted it to go, to have the product they wanted at the end of the day. I agree with Ryan. Maybe not that they're purposely trying to propagandize certain points of history, just that they were trying to create a film that they wanted to make with the narrative they wanted.
Yeah.
And I think certainly, as portrayed in the movie and as probably what happened, the men who fought on the Greek city-states side, they certainly would have viewed the war in terms of the perspective of their freedoms. But it wasn't like their society's overall freedoms. Obviously, everybody else wasn't free, but they were the ones who had the freedom to own slaves, for instance. That freedom was under threat from the East.
Right, and then they themselves seem to have a great amount of fear in that movie that they will become slaves to the Persian Empire. And maybe that doesn't mean, slavery literally, just maybe the stripping of their autonomy, even in a political sense.
Yeah, so I think like that, the sort of contradiction can exist where both sides can be viewed as like from their own perspectives. You can understand why both sides thought that they were on some level fighting for freedom, even if it was for their own freedom to own slaves, for example.
Right, and going off your point earlier as well, it seems that there's a kind of a consistent buildup in a lot of Western thinking of pitting the West as the free part of the world against the other. Not necessarily always the East, just the outside culture.
Yeah, that's something that doesn't fit into Western culture.
No, the West, I think, wants to see itself as the more always at least from the moral high ground perspective, is the more free, more liberty. And I think even today in Western history, we've kind of skirted over times in the West where we've kind of employed similar military conscription to fight conflicts as well.
So that's what we're going to be talking about today, really, isn't it, on the podcast, is this question of, well, is conscription government slavery? Is a free country that forces people to fight for them, is that truly a free country? That is the question of the day.
Right, and I think everyone here is going to bring their own perspective on it. But before we launch into it, I think we definitely want to get some definitions set up so that we're all on the same page about how we're going to define slavery at the very least. So whoever, we can kind of start going around, whoever has a good definition they like pulled up, I think we can kind of go through and create a consensus.
All right, I'll go first.
All right.
So I did a little Googling and I found this definition of slavery. There's two different ones here. The first one is a person held in servitude as chattel of another. And the second one is one that is completely subservient to a dominating influence.
Right, and I feel like at least in the instance we're talking about now, the second one would be more applicable.
Yes.
Unless we want to take, we can discuss maybe the idea that when you are a conscripted military member, maybe you are almost seen as a piece of property for the government.
And I think that is definitely the definition, because if you look at most soldiers back then, they weren't really viewed as a person. You were viewed as property. You were you belong to let's say a military, or the Spartan military.
Right.
You didn't really have any decision. You were just done as you're told.
Right, and I think that definitely fits in with the second part of the definition, being completely subservient. All right, and I guess I'll introduce my definition here as well. I pulled mine from Black's Law Dictionary, which is a U.S. legal resource for kind of giving legal definitions. This one states that the condition of a slave, that civil relation in which one man has absolute power over the life, fortune, and liberty of another. Which it seems even broader than the one that you found, Colin.
Yeah, I think that was definitely much broader than the one I did.
I mean, that seems to encapsulate a lot of other scenarios, even outside of just considering someone property, just any kind of dominance, almost. All right, Ryan, did you have one that you had pulled up?
Yeah, I've got one here from the Oxford Dictionary.
Sure.
And it's the condition in which the life, liberty, and fortune of an individual is held within the absolute power of another, which I agree with. Though one could argue that surely a soldier, whether he's there by voluntary means or otherwise, is a soldier not also sort of in this condition?
Well, they definitely have more limited liberties than your average citizen's going to.
But I think, at the end of the day, they chose that lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the life, liberty, and fortune of an individual is held within the absolute power of another.
Right.
So if you chose to join the military voluntarily, no coercion, no force, ultimately that set of circumstances is still true. So I think it's also important to remember, like, how is it you got there, I suppose. I think the most important part about the slavery is that someone is initially coerced through the threat of physical force or just blatantly forced through physical violence to enter that state, to enter that condition.
Right, and to add to your point on that one, Ryan, I know in the US there is a penalty for ignoring conscription.
Mm-hmm.
And the penalty I pulled up is for the selective service system, which is what the US calls the draft. But in this, if you dip out on your draft obligations, you're subject to a maximum, a 5-year prison sentence and a $10,000 fine, or both. So I think that would meet the definition of coercion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's the threat of, if you do not do just exactly as we demand of you, then we will send the police to come, who are armed, and they will use violent means if necessary to take hold of you and drag you off to a prison. That's slavery. I mean, think of it like the most traditional ideas of slavery, be it from, say, the Vikings in Britain capturing people, or Europeans off the coast of Africa. What do? Well, they enter the person's homeland, they capture them, and then they take them off to some compound where they make good use of them, which is kind of the same as what happens when you refuse to be conscripted, isn't it really?
I think it's kind of interesting they're going to use force on you so that they can employ you to then use force on others.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, it definitely is interesting like that. And I guess there you could argue, it's not because they do have a choice, but I mean, what choice is there when you're being forced to either way?
Absolutely. It's to call such a state military service, I think it's just laughable.
I think with that too, with the punishments for, trying to dodge a draft is more of like the illusion of choice. That's like, oh, hey, I had a choice, I could have run off or something. It's more of that illusion. But no, yeah, at the end of the day, you're being picked up and forced to do something.
I also think one of the sort of traditional ideas about slavery is that often you're involved in like the extraction of resources.
Right.
It could be on a plantation. It could be, say, in a mine, perhaps more recently. And so I actually came up with this example of where it wasn't just conscripts were forced to fight, say, to protect the country's freedom. In Britain, there was this group of conscripts called the Bevan Boys, and they were from 1942 or 1943 up until 1948. They were forced to mine coal in Britain. And if they refused, they were threatened with, and often many were, in fact, sent to prison. Some of those who refused to go into the coal mines and were sent to prison were also sentenced to hard labor in those prisons. And so any way that they tried to get out of being forced into forced labor, they couldn't have done it. It was decided for them that they had to, even after the war was over, even after the nation's existence was no longer under threat, they were forced to extract mineral resources for the wealth of the country. How is that freedom? How is that a free country? How are they not slaves? Like, what is the difference between being a slave then and being a slave, say, in like a Congolese mine or on a sort of a Florida plantation back in the day?
Right. I think it is important to point out that I don't think this covers all sins, but I think even the soldiers in that instance were compensated. I don't think that clears the debt. I think
No,
just because they compensate you doesn't mean that you're not having your liberties curtailed. But also, usually a military draft or a conscription is for a more limited period of time than being being in chattel slavery, which could potentially last for an entire lifetime.
Yeah, for example, like during the Civil War, you signed up for X amount of months or years and the regiment.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you did your time, you were done.
Of course, so long as you're not killed. For many people, when they were forced to become indentured servants, slaves, conscripts, whatever you'd like to call it, many of them obviously died. And so the term of their servitude was the term of their lives, effectively.
Right.
Yes.
Agree with that. And I think also, since as we pointed out a little bit earlier, looking at maybe the reason why these people are conscripted or enslaved is, Ryan pointed out, usually slavery has a connotation of resource gathering or wealth, whereas a government conscription for military, I'd say the motivation is a little different. It's about defense of the society.
Yeah, the protection or something.
Well, yeah, that is often the justification for it, isn't it?
Right.
But that's what I thought was so interesting about the Bevan boys, was that there was no justification after war is over to force people into resource extraction. And besides, I think also there should be the counter argument that if something is worth fighting for, then it should be blatantly obvious that your population will defend it. If your population is not willing to defend and risk their lives to defend, say, a country or whatever it may be, then perhaps it isn't worth saving.
I would agree with that. I think I share the same philosophy that if the citizens of the country that is engaged in the conflict believe in their own personal opinion that the conflict's just and that their society is worth either defending, or even if they're going on an offensive war, if their society is doing something noteworthy that they believe is just and right, that they'll volunteer their service without having to be conscripted.
Yeah, absolutely. I think not only would it mean that the nations at war would often put more effort into making sure that the soldiers are looked after, if they are fully aware that the soldiers could decide that actually this isn't for me, or if the citizenry could decide not to sign up in the first place. I think it would ensure that less wars would be fought for better reasons, because the government would be concerned about the public's willingness to go, I suppose. I can only see good reasons, to be honest, why you would want that, but who knows?
Right. I know you brought up the Bevan boys for the UK. I think Collin and Trevor both agree that the most negative connotation for conscription in the US happened during Vietnam.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. Vietnam, and definitely even more the Civil War, because even though that was a war to keep the Union preserved, if you had enough money, you could
Buy your
not
way out.
fight. Yeah, you could buy your way out, and I think that's even worse because now someone else has to take your spot.
Right.
And anything, you're just feeding the machine at that point.
You are, and I mean, clearly, especially in the style of warfare, that period, you needed bodies on the field. And conscription was probably the fastest way for them to accomplish their goals. I think
Yes.
even without them considering the societal ramifications of that act. Trevor, did you have any other definition you want to throw in here that's gonna?
I will mention the fact the Vietnam, how they tried to pull like 27 million people total, but
Right.
people keep getting knocked out of the draft for anything like a medical issue or having a criminal record would actually get you out of it. sometimes.
I also think it's interesting that, like, when you think of Vietnam, you also have to think about that draft and that negative connotation. But there was also a bunch of draftees during World War II, so I think it's also interesting how we see that draft in Vietnam as just, a negative connotation, while the one in World War II is more accepted. Granted, I guess you could argue it was for the fate, of Europe and all this other jazz, but at the end of the day, it's still the same thing.
I think many people, even though perhaps they were conscripted in the Second World War, perhaps they were more content about it, because often I think the Second World War is framed as a moral war, as a moral conquest over fascism. And so even if it perhaps doesn't sit completely well with people, I think people are more willing to accept the conscription under those circumstances, say particularly when the United States was so awfully attacked by the Japanese on their own. When you think of Vietnam, you think of, well, the Vietnamese never committed any attacks on America. The Vietnamese certainly were never infringing on any other country's right to exist.
Yeah, they never threatened America. It was mostly just ideological.
Yeah, there's no accusations from Vietnam, at least. Obviously, Cambodia came later. But at the time, there's no accusations of Vietnamese genocide. So I feel like the difference is that people don't view the Vietnam conflict as a moral war. People view that as a sort of a game of chess on the big screen, isn't it? Really?
Yeah,
So
I think
it's all about spheres of influence.
Yeah, it's definitely just seen as kind of just a part of the larger Cold War going on at the time.
Mm-hmm. Part of the Truman Doctrine. Yeah, a containment for communism. So I think that's why I think a lot of people were willing to forgive the first and second World Wars, but not the Vietnam War.
Yeah, because you could also argue it's like, what were they fighting for in Vietnam?
Exactly. What was it for? Like, was America at risk of being overrun? Quite possibly not. I would argue, but I think that raises the question: like, why did they bother with conscription then in the Second World War if everyone was so keen to go?
Right. I was going to play devil's advocate on your point. I think maybe a lot of the positive views that the West has about World War II might have come out after. I don't know. I'd have to at least dig in further and figure out at the time how people that were conscripted felt about it. I think it's easy for us to say it was a moral war, this far down the road.
Yeah, I think when so many movies I think it's possibly the most black and white conflict in terms of when it's painted in movies.
Right.
In terms of those are the good guys, those are the bad guys. And I think a lot of the media at the time, and obviously, say for instance, the British were fantastic at pumping out propaganda of their own, and after with American and British movies, I think it's reinforced the idea of the moral war, even if it might not have been completely so.
If you want to hear this stat, 50 million people between 18 and 45 willingly registered for the draft during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
That is a lot.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a crazy amount.
But
I think that's interesting too, is willingly, because I know when I turned 18, I had to register and vote and all this stuff, and there was no option for me not to sign up for the draft. It was you're signing up for the draft.
Yeah, no, if you're a U.S. male, they don't ask you if you want to. They send it to your house and tell you there's a penalty if you don't fill it out.
Yeah, exactly.
Does that feel like you're volunteering?
No.
So I think that's another.
Nobody in America believes that the draft is going to be used.
Yes. So it's just kind of like, it's just got to do it.
Yeah. Like for Americans, it's just a piece of paper you fill out when you're a male at a certain age. But I think Americans, especially after Vietnam, have a hard time believing that the government would actually institute the draft and conscript people in the military. But then again, we haven't seen a conflict on a scale large enough for the government, I don't think, to feel justified to do so.
I mean, at the time, those conflicts, as much as, Vietnam was not as large as World War II, they were still very, body intensive conflicts. They were taking extreme casualties.
I think we should talk about the casualties for a second, actually, because how should the fallen be remembered if they were forced into a conflict? Because if you think about it, if somebody chooses to go fight in a war and say this war is for a just cause, they chose to lay down their lives for a worthy cause, then I think it's blatantly obvious how they should be remembered. But if somebody is forced from their usual life into the military, forced to fight and kill against their will, and they as a result are killed, say overseas somewhere, for a war they didn't believe in, for a fight that wasn't ultimately theirs, but they were forced to be there. How should we remember them? Should we remember them as brave heroes, or should we remember them as tragic victims?
Yeah, that's a very good point there.
No, I'll say my first instinct when you asked that question was I'd say more victims.
Yeah.
Yes, because they didn't choose to be sent
Right.
over there. It's just something they got swept up and caught in.
Yeah,
Same thing as
absolutely.
Pearl Harbor. Memorial for the people who died. It was for a remembrance for that reason.
Yeah, you could definitely point to say, take for instance some of the inner sort of United States. I don't know, some of the farming ones, Kansas or whatever, growing up there, and then being conscripted and sent to Europe, and you end up getting killed. Chances are, if you stayed home, you would have been just fine.
Yeah.
It was directly as a consequence of your conscription that you were killed. And, that's 40, 50, whatever years of your life taken away from you. That's not very fair.
Right,
That
and
does-
obviously the government's not going to compensate anyone for your loss. But they will tell you that, your loss obviously was necessary for the continuation of the nation.
Mhm.
And I'll throw this out there, it almost seems like conscription is the nation placing the collective above the individual.
I would say that it is, yeah.
Yeah.
It's taking for granted that your life is worth less than some other value. Could it be the nation? Could it be an ideal? Could it be an economic system? Could be anything. But I think it ultimately must be the decision from somewhere, from someone, that your life is worth less than some higher purpose, and they're going to use you for that higher purpose.
Right.
Whether you agree with that or not.
And I think I'll bring this up, even from the level of practicality, it seems like you'd want soldiers that want to be there rather than conscripts that are resistant to the cause you're trying to carry out.
Yeah, I think on the level of practicality, if you are very keen not to be there, if you're keen just to go home and resume your life, and you're not going to be somebody who's taking initiative, you're not going to be somebody who is always thinking about how to get one up on the enemy, who is advocating for night patrols or night raids, or particularly keen on getting at the enemy, you're going to want
You're just there to serve your service.
Yeah,
you're just gonna
want
want
to do your time and get out.
Yeah, shut up, keep your head down, and keep moving.
And you could argue that's possibly why, despite the US's high involvement in terms of conscripts from the war, why they weren't all that effective.
I don't know how many it could have been, but how many people could have just deserted? Like, they'd be in a foreign country, of course, but they could have done it.
Yeah, but I know there's a big movement up to Canada, but I think it's also like, think about this. If you are forced to, say, go outside, right, and you've got to dig a hole in the ground and sit in there and get shot at, you're not particularly going to be all that pleased about it. And you're not going to do a good job of anything that you're told. When the guy who's telling you to do all these things, who's commanding you, well, you didn't choose him to be your boss. This is just some guy who's appointed himself into the position of being your boss, and now he's shouting at you, and now you've been given a gun, and now it's also very terrible. If you don't want to be somewhere, you're going to do the least amount possible in order just to get away from there.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting too. We've been talking a lot of like U.S. draftees, but I mean, even if you look at like during the World War II, Russian and German conscripts, a lot of times they were just seen as human fodder. They used them to clear out minefields just with their bodies, and a lot of times if they weren't told to do something and they refused, they were just shot right there on the spot.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So it's another thing like that's like, I think that right there is just real slavery, because they don't have a choice anyways. There's not even an illusion of choice. It's like, you're doing this or you're going to get shot, and they're treated like property. Willingly just throw them in front of a minefield to see if there's any mines.
Right, and I think some of that comes even from the Soviet and German World War II, the Nazi mindset. They were more collectivist than individualist.
Yes.
In their societies, and I think it's easier for collectives, government, and I'll make this argument, to spend your citizens' lives to defend the nation when the nation is seen as the peak of your society. And the defense of the state for them, I think, is more clearly more important than the individual.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think when we've been talking about conscripts, we've been thinking about nations that, at least vaguely, we can all agree worth fighting for. But like, there's very many nations who rely on conscription who are most certainly not worth fighting for, who commit genocide, who break human rights on the daily. For
North
instance,
Korea.
say this North Korea.
Well, not even
Soviet
North
Union,
Korea. A lot of
Nazi
military,
Germany.
European militaries do a lot of mandatory service. Necessarily doesn't have to be boots on the ground, but it is a form you have to do X amount of years of service.
Well, when we're talking about nations that are breaking, say, the Geneva Convention.
Right. And I think, to give another example on that line, I think we're thinking more of, it's even by being identified in the international community is the major problem of African recruitment of children into the militaries. And that's clearly a form of conscription.
Yes.
And we don't, we look down on that, don't find that acceptable because it's not.
Yeah.
But the West they'll conscript just in a more acceptable way. And that's based on age.
Especially with like child soldiers too. Like a lot of people don't think about that. Children are very, easily influenced. So at that point, it's not just slavery, it's indoctrination.
Right. And I think we can agree to a large part that indoctrination is part of military service.
Yes.
Yeah.
To be effective, there are certain things that they need you to carry out at certain times. And I think indoctrination helps to achieve those ends.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest negatives of being in a modern military is the sort of the alienation, the sort of dehumanizing processes that you need to go through in order to be a trained killer. I know the modern Western militaries involve themselves in psychology to try and increase the rate at which people shoot to kill, to try and increase people's reflexes in terms of not thinking about orders, but just following them out no matter what they are. And I think that's awful and destructive, and it concerns me.
Well, it's the whole thing too. It's like, why are you training to shoot at a human target? Obviously, so that's what you're going to be shooting at. But it's also just a subconscious thing. It's you're going to be used to shooting at a human target. You're going to be used to just seeing that image.
Right. And I think history is full of examples of, especially when you're dealing with an active conflict, of dehumanizing the other to make it easier for your soldiers to psychologically accept that they're taking a life, especially if they don't see that life as equal to theirs. And you have to look back to World War II you can easily find examples of that, dehumanizing the other on both sides of the conflict. The US dehumanizing Japanese and German soldiers, and the Germans dehumanizing the West.
And the worst part is, like, they would dehumanize the Germans, just go with this example, and not all of them were like bad people. They were just there the same reason they were forced to do it.
Not everyone was, SS going around and slaughtering Jews and, raping anyone they saw. A lot of them were just, regular Wehrmacht people who were just doing it to defend their country or they thought was right.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of them would have also been conscripts who didn't want to be there, and there's this awful thought of conscript meeting conscripts, and everybody who's involved really does not want to be there. But they're all under the threat of force and violence, and it's either you could go try and leave, desert, and you'll possibly be thrown in jail, or I know particularly at the end of the war for the Germans, they were just shooting anyone who they even suspected without trial of being a deserter. And obviously for the Soviets, very much the same thing all the way through the war. So you had the situation where you would have perhaps battalions or divisions of people who did not want to be there, but they're all forced to kill each other under threat of they themselves being killed by the higher ups. It's a terrible thing. If conscription, if we all agree that conscription is indeed slavery, if it's immoral, if somehow it was one day to be forbidden across the world, then I think the scale and sort of the devastation and tragedy of war would be severely diminished.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring up the Japanese too, because even though a lot of them were forced in the service, it was kind of seen as the right thing to do, and especially the honorable thing to do, especially since at that time they saw the emperor as a god, that he was a divine being.
Well, yeah, that comes back to the whole thing about sort of the trouble with like collectives and the trouble with crowds, believing that someone is above you, say a god emperor, or believing that it's the right thing to do, it's what society expects of you, therefore you've got to go off and get killed. I think that's incredibly destructive.
Yes. No, it is very incredibly destructive.
It is, and I think to point to both of y'all's points about kind of if there was an end to conscription in governments, the warfare wouldn't be as tragic. I personally don't see the incentive for government to not have the power to draw upon that manpower source. Because I think if you're thinking in purely government, realpolitik terms, you don't want to cut yourself off from a resource that you might need to survive.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't think any government would ever reasonably do that.
No, yeah, they would not, because it's such that pool of manpower you can drive off of. Not just, let's think of it, not just combat. It takes a lot of manpower and resources to keep these troops in the field. So you could throw them into other stuff. Cooks, radio operators, tank drivers, airplane pilots, anything like that.
Perhaps an interesting point could be drawn here. Perhaps, I know, for instance, say, there are countries that exist, such as perhaps even, could be Panama. I know Iceland doesn't really have a military. So perhaps nations like that would forbid conscription on the grounds that they never reasonably expect to fight anyway. They're in the shadow of superpowers who would look after them. But any self-respecting state that's going to fight for itself would never outlaw conscription. But we could all agree that mankind as a whole, that the populations of every nation would benefit from the outlawing of conscription. And we could agree that the interests of the states who would never ban conscription are not always in line with the people that they serve.
No, and I think it's interesting that we can argue about how much they serve certain people if they're requiring them to go die basically on the government's behalf.
Mhm.
There's a relationship there that gets, I think a lot of people in the West, we believe that the government, in large part, especially in the American context, the government serves the people.
Yes.
But when you see when it really comes down to the crunch, that relationship is strained, and you see things like the government conscripting citizens to fight on its behalf because it doesn't want to be destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there needs to be the question of, like, why do we live? What is the purpose of, say, having a state? What is the purpose of having armies? Well, we often think that the purpose of having a state is to serve the people. The purpose of having an army is to serve the people. But it seems to be the case that conscription is the people serving the states the wrong way around.
Right, and I think to our point earlier about volunteer service is if the people in the state want the state to survive, they'll step up and put in service.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can see a lot of that thinking reflected in people like Aristotle, who he put the state in a very high regard because he believed in it. Even to the end of his his trial with the state, he still believed that the state was worth saving.
Yes.
And I think in his writings, I'm in Socrates. Yeah, you're right. To his point though, I think for him, state service was attractive because he believed in the state. And I think if the ideals of the state were not what he believed in, I don't think he would have advocated service for it.
Mm-hmm. There's something certainly poetic, and I think there's a message to be taken from the fact that Socrates was such a lover of democracy and it voted to kill him.
Right.
And I think a lesson can be taken from that about the dangers of the state going too far, and how often we can lose sight of what's important, which is the individuals being free to live their lives as they wish. And if fighting in the government's army is what is best for you, then I think people should be free to make their own decisions. I think we're all reasonably in agreement there.
Right. No, I think if you voluntarily enter into a contract of service with the government for military service, that's perfectly fine. What you're getting into.
Yeah, exactly.
But when the government coerces you into service because they're afraid they're not going to survive, I think that creates a different relationship.
And also going back to 300, if we think about that one chap who survived the first battle,
right?
Was that at the Hot Gates or whatever they call it?
Yeah,
Thermopylae. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that chap actually was forced to get himself killed in the next battle because I think it's in Thucydides about how people rejected him. even though he was supposedly sent back to tell the story of their heroic deeds, there was this collective perspective that he hadn't given enough, that he had to die in order for him to be worthy. And so he had to go and get himself killed in the next battle just to meet the standards of everybody else, which I think is awful. He'd done such a brave act, and yet still he wasn't free. And the only thing that was good enough was giving his own life, which, he had to throw his life away for other people. That's awful.
And I think that is kind of a reflection of Sparta's collectivist attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Is that your service to the state is almost, I believe in their minds, it was the most highly valuable possession they had.
Was Sparta a free country if all those men were mandated to die?
I think some of them were true believers. But I think when you require every male to give service, you remove the choice from them. So I would argue it's not free.
Yeah.
And on top of that, the irony is that every function outside of the military was built upon a slave populace that the Spartans held.
Yeah, they didn't have to do any other jobs besides the military because everything else was already taken care of.
Yeah.
Right, they had a servile class.
Yeah, even though there's records that the Spartan slaves were well taken care of, they're still slaves at the end of the day. They're still in service of someone without a choice.
Right, which is very much like the Spartans themselves. So they perpetuate this government where they're almost enslaved to their own society.
And I really don't know about the claim of slaves being well taken care of back in the day. I think with that level of technology, it would have taken a lot to support the living.
Relative to the time period.
I know, for instance, like there was one, I think, recent example of we found. Was it at Pompeii that we found two well-preserved people, and one of them was so hunchbacked, and we reckon that he was in fact a slave, perhaps in his younger years. I think maybe around about his 20s, and his body was already hunchback and almost broken because of the labor that he was expected to endure for other people. So I don't know if I necessarily believe that slaves could have been well treated. Perhaps like house servants, perhaps some females or some very rare males had it better, but I
will push back on Collin as well, because I know the Spartans harbored a society they called the Cryptia. They would go out once a year and hunt down helots just to keep them in line. They terrified them, basically.
That is
and they were allowed for I think it was one day out of the year to freely kill them. So, I mean, they might have been relatively treated better as a slave class than some other society, but they were still
I should have worded that
terrorized.
better. Yes, they were still terrorized. I was just trying to, in the context of slavery when we're talking about the Spartans.
Right, and I think I will say though, kind of in your line of argument, that the Spartans did allow some of their servile class to fight alongside them, and when they did honor them for their military service. Because the Spartans holding military service so highly, even if it was someone that was a non-Spartan fighting alongside them, they did appreciate and honor that.
Was there a chance of being a free man in Sparta if you perform military service for the state? I don't know if this is something that we know.
After you were served in the military, you were supposed to be like an elder in charge of politics. I don't know if all of them had to be, or if you mean.
I mean, like not Spartan citizens, Spartan slaves. If Spartan slaves had managed to be allowed to perform military service, would they have had to return to the state of slavery afterwards?
Well, I think the class of Spartan, kind of the servile class that was allowed to be in the military and performed a lot of the support functions for the military, they were seen as a little bit higher than slaves, but I don't think they could climb up the social ladder much higher than that. Like they were more relatively free compared to like somebody like the Helots, who are the lowest slave class in Sparta. Because the Helots, while some of them had military service, it was very limited to what they could and couldn't do. Like I know they couldn't serve as mainline hoplites. They had to serve as skirmishers or some other branch of the armed forces. The Spartans didn't seem as equal to themselves.
Yes.
But I'm not sure if they could climb up the social ladder in anything higher than what they were born as.
Yeah, I haven't seen any examples of that either. I think once you were locked in as being a slave, that was it. That was, your slave.
No, as a Spartan though, you could fall down the ladder.
Yes, that is true.
And if you didn't perform your state obligations, you were if not exiled, then treated as a pariah. Kind of like your example of the one survivor from Thermopylae. All right, so I think everyone's kind of at the conclusion that I don't think anyone disagrees that we all believe that conscription we see as a form of slavery by government.
Yeah.
I would end up agreeing that. Yeah.
Yeah, good discussion.
Yeah. Anything else that we want to add before we wrap it up?
I guess I have this pulled up. So
Sure.
there are multiple countries that have gotten rid of conscription, Poland being one of them. But if there aren't enough volunteers for a war, they get rid of that and they have conscription again. So what's the point of getting rid of it if it's something that the government wants to declare war on somebody and they need people, but people don't want to fight for that cause? They can just force them in anyway.
That is interesting.
I'm sure it makes people feel better when there isn't a conflict that they won't be drafted.
Yeah.
I guess it's more of that, like we were talking about earlier with, it's just the illusion.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, that's it.
Any other final points? All right.
No.
I guess close out kind of with our normal, we had a conversation here and everyone gave their own opinion, but definitely don't stop at ours. To go out and do your own research. And even if you have some pushback on what we said today, definitely form your own opinions and have your own arguments.
Yeah, that's very important. Don't just listen to people. Go out and make sure, that information is correct, or, just form your own opinion.
I have a piece of advice: read Thucydides or find an audiobook online. It is worth your time.
It is.
Yeah, it's a good audiobook.
I know the Spartan Constitution is also available online, because I did look at that as well. So you can dig into some research there.
Yeah, I think we can wrap it up. This has been a good talk.
All right. Well, this has been the third episode of History Through Our Screens, and we are going to wrap it up here.